Send yourself back to 2016, when you were first playing through Ashes of Ariandel, the first DLC of Dark Souls 3. You were at the final boss of the DLC, Sister Friede. After a while, you beat her first phase, and since you already watched the reveal trailer, you fully expected her to have a second phase, because it showed Father Ariandel going haywire during it. And I mean, come on, you're playing Dark Souls, am I right? Sure enough, a cutscene plays, showing you what you saw in the trailer. But what's this? Friede gets back up. The trailer didn't show her in frame at all, so to your surprise, this turns out to be a dual boss fight, akin to Ornstein and Small all those years ago. You realize they share a health bar, so you don't need to individually kill them, and focusing Father Ariandel is a better strategy because he's the one that follows you for melee attacks, and Sister Friede approaches you more slowly if you stay away from her, but does have some long distance delayed attacks, so you do have to keep on your toes. And also casts a healing spell, so you have to occasionally break away from Ariandel to focus her. You struggle for a while, but then you finally get him down. You get a Titanite slab, a little disappointing, but sure. Wait, did I ever get the Air of Fire? Pause right here. Depending on what kind of player you are, how long you've been playing the games, etc., this is where you branch off into two different thought processes. You're either freaking out and super excited, the madman finally did it, he gave us the first genuine 3-phase boss fight in the series. Or you groan in disappointment, realizing that From Software has finally jumped the shark, becoming some sort of anime slob. Now I'm not here to tell you that it's definitively one or the other, that'll ultimately be up to you to decide for yourself. What I will do is break down how the hidden boss health bars were handled historically in the modern From Software games, the few different ways it was implemented, and the pros and cons to all the methods they've done. Because believe it or not, yeah, there's more to discuss than simply just whether a new boss health bar pops up or not. The earliest example I could find of a hidden boss face in the modern From Software catalog is actually the only one there is in Demon Souls, being Man-Eaters. If you're unaware, the boss itself doesn't particularly have any change in pattern or what have you, but once enough time passes, or you reach a certain threshold of the Man-Eater's health bar, a second Man-Eater will appear, with a full new boss health bar that wasn't shown prior to this point. Being that this is the first and only time that this happens in this game, it undoubtedly is intended to be a shock and increase the stress of the player, given the first boss is already difficult and aggressive in itself, and now there's a second one coming in to wreck you, while the other is likely still alive. This is certainly effective in accomplishing that, but due to the narrow arena, and there only being one obstacle to split them up, not to mention both are as aggressive as the other, an execution that definitely is an excessive boost in difficulty at best, or borderline unfair at worst. The only real way to mitigate it is having enough damage and aggression to defeat the first one before the second can be a problem, which most new players won't be able to do. Being that this is the first attempt at doing something like this, it certainly is easy to give them a pass for it, especially when looking at it in retrospect, as we'll very shortly see another attempt at this format that worked much better. I do want to mention that although this is the only boss with a hidden health bar, there's a few bosses with second phases. The first one I want to discuss being Storm King, which follows a somewhat traditional two-step fight format, in that you have to kill 6 of the smaller storm beasts flying around before the big one will come down and be in range of being attacked. But the storm beast health bar was shown the whole time after you enter the boss arena, and won't take direct damage from killing the smaller beasts, so you'll be clued into the fact that there's more to the fight. In this case, it's formatted like this more so in order for you to find a way to damage the flying enemies before you have to deal with the full threat. A more low-key example is Flame Lurker. He doesn't have a change in his moveset, but he does become noticeably more aggressive once he passes the halfway point of his health bar. And he also gets brighter overall, so the idea being that he's being enraged, I suppose. And lastly, you could say that the Dragon God has 3 stages to this fight as well, given you have to traverse his arena to fire off ballistas to immobilize him, before being able to damage him yourself. By now I hope the distinction between a second phase and a hidden health bar is clear, because they will be important later on. Not all second phases are a hidden phase, but all hidden phases are a second or a third phase. And they certainly all look very different per boss. And by the way, I won't mention every single second or multi-phase boss in this video if it doesn't have a hidden health bar. They'll mostly serve as a reference point. Looking at Dark Souls 1 now, here's where we see the example I mentioned earlier where they improve on Man-Eaters for a more rounded boss fight, being the Bell Gargoyles. Before the fight starts, in the cutscene you can see that there's 2 gargoyles in the tower, or at least 2 that don't look like they're actual stone, being a possible clue that there's a second one that will come in later, so that'd be a potential hint to Eagle Eye players to be on their toes. Though I imagine any Demon Souls players would see this coming a mile away, especially if they do see the other one. Once the fight actually begins, it's a similar setup in that the first gargoyle has to be damaged enough for the second one to show up, but only then showing the second health bar. In this case, there doesn't seem to be a timer. Regardless, this is where the similarities end mechanically, as the second gargoyle coming in has a much more restricted AI in order for the fight to be more balanced. For instance, he is much more likely to use a sweeping fire attack rather than use melee attacks. The second one also comes in with half HP, not being as brutally demoralizing, and yet still adding another layer to the challenge if you were already struggling with the first one. And given this has proven to be a wall for a lot of first time players, despite not being as rough as man-eaters, it still works as an obstacle to overcome, I think. However, when I think about this game, I'm sure there's another fight that comes to mind even more so than Bell Gargoyles. Of course, I'm talking about Ornstein and Smo. The way this dynamic duo is set up has been analyzed to death. I suspect you won't hear anything new from me that you may not have heard already. I've even talked about it myself already. But given the subject matter of the video is more so on the hidden boss health bars, here's something that might have been lost in the conversation from time to time, and something I may have a small critique about actually. Despite me loving this fight all around, I've always been unsure on how I feel about how the second phase is handled. We surely all know that you essentially get to pick how the second phase goes, by killing the other boss. So for instance, if you kill Smo first, you get to fight a beefed up version of Ornstein, and vice versa. And that in itself is great. But one small thing that always bothered me is how the damage you dealt on the other boss that isn't felled will be fully negated on this additional second phase, because the boss will regain all their HP. You could argue that this will only be a problem once, and then you just have to adjust your tactics accordingly. And while there's some truth to that, that doesn't really apply when you consider how many attempts someone could potentially have been doing a strategy, where perhaps they weren't focusing on any one boss. You were instead taking careful pot shots at whoever was closest when the opportunity arose. You can certainly also argue that trading off damage between the two isn't optimal, as it's just a harder way to fight the boss. You're essentially going to have both of them nearly the entire boss fight, but I think that's why it bothers me. If someone is taking the time to fight both of them at the same time, the likely objectively harder strategy that requires more patience, and manages to do it, you will essentially punish this player the hardest once they realize it was for naught, when it's a clever strategy in its own way. At this point, say if the second phase still happened, you could have the super version of the boss still have at least some of the cut damage on it, so it could nearly circumvent the second phase. Or perhaps if you literally kill them both within a few second time frame, you could end the fight early, and maybe even get both souls as a reward for your tenacity. If this boss is already going to have a choice where you can pick which one to fight as a final phase, why not go a step further without punishing a certain playstyle as well, you know? I can't say I particularly remember how I did it my first time. I think I was focusing Smo being the bigger target and easier to hit, and I would occasionally hit the other boss if I found an opening. But I don't recall being overly frustrated about Ornstein getting his HP back. Maybe just some slight annoyance. But from there I obviously adjusted my playstyle. This is simply a scenario I've thought about here and there throughout the years. Like I said, I still greatly like the fight, and it's one of my favorites in the series. This is more so food for thought more than anything. I will say, I do think there's at least one fight later on that did the Ornstein and Smo formula just a little bit better. But we'll discuss that when we get there. These two would actually be the only boss fights with outright hidden health bars. But to quickly look at other noteworthy multi-phase boss fights. In a similar vein to the Man-Eaters and Gargoyles comparison, Dragon God also got another attempt in Dark Souls in the Bed of Chaos, being another 3-stage fight where you can't harm the boss itself at first, but unlike the other ones, this one could arguably be worse, depending on who you ask. And lastly, I want to bring up Sif, as this is a unique case where there's a second phase of sorts, but instead of making the fight harder, Sif actually gets noticeably weaker, as she starts limping after you reach a small threshold of the boss fight. Obviously this is more intended as a gut punch moment to make you consider your actions in the narrative, rather than a mechanical choice, but it's an interesting contrast to what we've seen so far, and certainly for what we're going to be seeing later on. I hope it's become clearer that so far, the second phase thing has been used extremely sparingly. We roughly have 4 bosses in both of the previous games, and only 1 or 2 contain a completely hidden boss health bar per game. So diving into Dark Souls 2, they start using the phase 2 trope a fair amount more. I counted 8 bosses with 2 phases, though given that there's nearly double the number of bosses in Dark Souls 2 than there is in 1, perhaps it's not disproportional. Despite all this, I only found 2 bosses that have a fully hidden health bar. The dual cat fight with Ludden Zolan, and Burnt Ivory King. Yes, I had to get footage of Ludden Zolan. You can thank me by becoming a member of the channel with less than $1.20. What's interesting about both of these hidden boss health bar examples, however, is that both of these are somewhat telegraphed. For Ludden Zolan, you can literally see the second boss in the background if you're paying attention, similar to how the Bell Gargoyles worked, and even more prominently due to it being a black cat that contrasts against the snow. And given it's just another cat fight like the one you already did earlier in the DLC, no doubt you'll suspect something is up with this one regardless. Doesn't make the fight good or anything, but at least it's somewhat upfront about it. And for Burnt Ivory King, despite working the exact opposite of Storm King, the health bar not being there at all until the boss shows up, it functionally accomplishes exactly the same thing. You have already crossed the fog gate, the arena is too epic to just be a room with a bunch of relatively normal enemies with no health bar, so undoubtedly you expect the boss comes later, once you're adjusted to the situation at your own pace. I suppose you can make this as an argument there aren't any true hidden boss faces or something, especially the latter, but given the difficulty that these pose already, and being endgame content, it's surprisingly merciful in this regard, especially for Dark Souls 2. Now Bloodborne is definitely where things start to get interesting because, well, from this game onward, what boss didn't have at least one extra phase on it? I looked through all of them, excluding challenge dungeons, and it's easier to list what bosses didn't have a second phase. Some of these include Cleric Beast, Vicar Amelia, and Moon Presence, though these last two kinda do, they just mostly have an additional attack or two once you reach a certain threshold, which definitely complicates this a little bit. What constitutes a second phase starts to get a lot more nebulous as we go on. Thankfully for our purposes of the video subject, the hidden health bars are mostly cut and dry, and Bloodborne only has one as far as I could see. Again, excluding challenge dungeons, which even then I think it's only like one. But aside from that, it's only the Witches of Hemwick. This one falls in a similar vein as Maneaters and the Bell Gargoyles, as the second health bar only shows up later on, but whenever you kill the first witch. I say only similar because in reality, this isn't the same kind of fight. It's a bit of a puzzle situation, and the second witch is actually there the whole time. You can fight her, and even kill her before the first one without showing the second health bar. So it's still a little bit different and interesting in its own right. Now finally reaching Dark Souls 3, definitely the genesis of the topic for me, as during the timeline of this game's release is when I actually started to think about this topic more deeply. On a similar note as Bloodborne, it's easier to note the bosses that didn't have a second phase or more, and the only two I found are Wonir and Ancient Wyvern, which yeah, what a catalog, huh? As for bosses with hidden health bars, I counted a record-breaking 7 in Dark Souls 3, including the DLCs, and we'll be looking at each of them individually. The first one you're unavoidably going to encounter is the Abyss Watchers. Just to break it down real quick, the fight starts up as a solo fight, but within a few seconds, you see a second Watcher rise up and start ganking you with the first one. Then after some more seconds, a third one rises, but instead of attacking you, it most likely will attack the other two Abyss Watchers, though it can attack you directly if you are the closest target or if you hit it. This all happens within the same health bar, though the second and third Watchers don't affect the main health bar, it's only the first one. Once you knock out the first Watcher, regardless of the other two, they all fall, and one singular Abyss Watcher will rise up one more time with a new fresh health bar and an expanded moveset, though it still largely is similar. Given this is an equivalent sore spot for many first time players like the Bell Gargoyles, and that it's an early-ish boss that stonewalls some players, not only has more than one opponent, but also a second health bar, I do think it's a perfect spot to discuss a broader point that has only truly become applicable so far, but will be a strong criticism point going forward. Before Dark Souls 3, healing methods have been fairly loose. Demon's Souls has multiple grasses that you can use to heal, and can stack and farm them as necessary. Dark Souls 1 has the more restrictive Estus Flask system, which made it better for not spamming healing items, especially in boss fights, but also for exploring. But even this system has its own quirks, such as being able to have up to 20 flasks, and you can also use Humanity on top of that to fully heal as needed, though the animation left you much more vulnerable than Estus. Dark Souls 2 had limited flasks, but it also had life gems, which act much more like grass in Demon's Souls, and sort of negates what they were trying to do in Dark Souls 1. And finally, Bloodborne has a generous cap of 20 heavy healing items, blood vials, and it's very restrictive to have more healing than that. My point in saying this is that generally speaking, you have more than enough healing items for any encounter. It's more so about finding good places to heal when you need to than anything. In Dark Souls 3, you could say healing took its final form, which has lasted up until the current day with Elden Ring and stuff, which is simply that you will get more Estus Flasks as you find more of a specific item by exploring. And additionally, there's another item that gives you more power to each flask drink as you gain more HP as well. If you played these games a long time, especially these newer ones, you've probably gotten a gist that once you waste enough flasks on an early stage of a boss fight, that attempt you're currently on is basically null, because you have much less room for failure as the fight goes on. At its worst, people usually just let the boss kill them so they can reset the encounter and try again with a hopefully better attempt. Now the way I'm framing this may make it sound like it's bad design or a bad habit from players. It's not. Until you introduce hidden health bars. Starting with Dark Souls 3, more so than ever, having hidden health bars may introduce a genuinely debilitating frustration point if you've been hard stuck at a boss for a really long time, having limited healing. and then finding out there's a hidden face to it that you couldn't have accounted for prior because it wasn't part of the initial health bar. If found in this situation and healing was a problem, in Demon Souls you could farm them, in Dark Souls 1 you could kindle the bonfire from your flasks, in Dark Souls 2 you could buy more life gems, and Bloodborne it's a little more tight, but you could also take advantage of rallying and stuff. So it's not often a problem, I think. But for Dark Souls 3 it can certainly become a problem. Let's use Abyss Watcher specifically as an example. You start off the game with 4 flasks, assuming you don't use any Ashen flasks at that. By this point in the game you can find 5 more flask shards, so you can have a max of 9 flasks while fighting Abyss Watchers, with little other means of healing, and even less of the bone shards that increase the healing, at only 3. Now I do want to make it clear that I'm not saying that hidden boss health bars are bad for this reason. I'm mostly posing this as a severe con to them that should be considered going forward, at least for the first time you reach a hidden phase. From there you could adjust accordingly, and you could use other methods to boost your chances, like upgrading weapons, and Abyss Watchers themselves aren't super tanky bosses. Upgrading weapon and damage is probably what you should do if you're struggling with them. But I think the psychological effects of this shouldn't be lost in the conversation either. These can be extremely hard games for first time players, so if you reach a point where the frustration overcomes a sense of accomplishment, which is what these games are intended to achieve, then the effect just backfires on themselves. After that long-winded monologue, let's look at the rest of the Dark Souls 3 hidden health bar bosses. You actually don't see another one until the end of the game basically, first one up being Lothric and Lorien. This one falls in the somewhat obvious category, due to you predictably having the gist that Lothric may be involved once you down Lorien, and it just turns out to be an expansion of Lothric's moveset, so it's actually somewhat more merciful than if you had an entirely different fight to learn. The only other detail is that Lorien does get revived indefinitely if you only focus on him, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that you could predict that happening, given that it already happened once. So you probably do have the gist that you need to kill Lothric at the very least. Next one up is Nameless King, yet another fight that you can probably see coming as a two-faced boss fight, given the rider is shown, and you can't really reach him with your attacks, so no reason to believe he'll die alongside the dragon. The last one for the base game is Soul of Cinder, which isn't specifically telegraphed to have a hidden face, but if there's any boss that you can probably guess has one, it'd be the boss that is gated behind the 4 lords, you know? So I suspect it wouldn't be surprising. Given their endgame status, you could probably argue you're much better equipped in healing than something like Abyss Watchers, being at a max of 15 flasks. And the telegraphing on top of that probably makes it much more palatable that there's more to it than meets the eye. But shortly after that, we finally wrap around back to the beginning of the video. I've more or less already described how this fight is formatted in the beginning, so let's just jump right into it. The problem I described during Abyss Watchers is literally twofold with Sister Friede, having not only a second hidden phase, but a third one as well, the first boss in the series to go this far. Now I should acknowledge that we have had plenty of 3-stage boss fights already. We've already mentioned a few before with Dragon God and the Bed of Chaos, but if you want to ignore those due to the nature of those fights, we don't need to look that much further after those. Even as early as Dark Souls 2, we have both of the Smelter Demons, which both have 2 different buff phases. One where they ignite their body and start giving you chip damage when you are nearby, and the second when they ignite their sword. If you want to ignore even those, in Bloodborne, Father Gascoigne, the first mandatory boss, has their starting phase, to a 2-handed axe form, which has a fairly distinct moveset, and then the wolf form. There's actually plenty of other examples in Bloodborne if you want to look even further, but my point is that we've had 3-phase bosses already. But whether they're hidden as a surprise health bar afterwards or not, makes the whole difference. So do I think Sister Friede is a little flawed due to this? Maybe a little bit, yeah. With Abyss Watchers I already described that they're a little bit squishy, so you have a good amount of options to get through them eventually. While you could theoretically encounter Friede super early given the DLC entry point is early in the game, it's not until you have endgame gear and levels that it's actually somewhat of a balanced fight, if we're talking first time players. So there's not much you can do to improve your standing outside of just getting better at 3 whole separate boss fights, with substantial differences and not small health bars. Otherwise the other move at this point is just googling a build that's strong against her, which there are plenty of options, but once you start resorting to changing your build in an RPG, maybe there's room to reconsider some things. The only other boss in this DLC also has a hidden health bar, with Champion's Gravetender. Yep. Given it's just a guy with some wolves at first, you can predict something will happen afterwards, and sure enough it does. But it's not that interesting or unique at this rate, so moving on. Now I think FromSoft acknowledges this as a potential flaw, because after Ashes of Ariandel and their follow-up DLC, Ring City, for one they only had 1 boss with a hidden health bar out of 4. But the rest of the bosses sort of went back to having a single health bar and simply hiding their phases within the single health bar, like Gascoigne as we discussed earlier. Still allowing for some surprise, but not crushing his spirits in terms of healing distribution. Theoretically, this is the best way to avoid the problem that was more prevalent in Dark Souls 3, but it does admittedly have its own drawbacks. Yeah. So I will admit that this character isn't fully leveled for DLC. I don't think he even had max level weapons, but it doesn't look much different even with a properly leveled character. I mean, hell, if you look at the same character fighting Friede, even this makes it somewhat evident. So what's my personal assessment of this method? Well, it's certainly the lesser of two evils. It allows you to know how to manage your healings right off the bat, and it just takes the first hit for you to do on the boss to realize it's gonna be a little bit of a grind. And I think I'm willing to give it some leeway given it's the actual last piece of content you're intended to do in Dark Souls 3. Which to some degree I'm also okay giving Friede grace. I don't think it's an awful fight or anything, but when looking at it from a first playthrough perspective, I definitely have more problems with one than the other. Do let me know what you think. Do you like the hidden boss phase setup or do you prefer it to be in a single health bar? At least in Ring City, obviously the bosses don't have to be tanks to begin with. And if you have any memorable stories from any of the bosses like Sister Friede, positive or negative, I'm happy to hear them. But before moving on from Dark Souls 3, let's discuss the one exception from the Ring City DLC, Demon Princess. To briefly go over it, this boss starts out as a dual fight where the bosses pass aggro between each other periodically, very clearly telegraphed with visual and audio. And you do have to kill them both individually, before the last one you kill rises again, stronger than before, as the final phase. And depending on which you fell, they'll have a different special moveset, but it's only between 2 or 3 attacks. You could argue that there was a hint to this last phase in the reveal trailers of Ring City, similar to Ashes of Ariandel, since what they do show is the Demon Prince, but their design doesn't change enough to be super clear that this is the case. I will mention, and maybe you've already seen it by now, but even these guys are a little tanky, especially in that final phase. But I will admit that I have a soft spot for this fight, because I find it incredibly cleverly balanced, and very fair in almost all aspects, that I personally don't mind how tanky they are, on top of having their final hidden phase. If you recall earlier, I mentioned one boss that I thought did the ONS formula better, at least mechanically. Well, this is the one. Admittedly, this fight is more tailor-made for that strategy, because of how the two bosses will trade off aggro, so it's not like ONS could straight up take the strategy and work as well, and it's certainly not as iconic as ONS, but I just appreciate it tons. If you want to hear my expanded thoughts on the fight, I discussed that in the same video I alluded to earlier. This actually isn't where the conversation ends when it comes to different methods of how the game has handled it, because Sekiro had its own solutions when it comes to hidden health bars. Now I will say that it still has some bosses with undeniable health bars, we'll look at that shortly, but if you're unaware, every single boss and mini-boss in this game has anywhere from 1 to 3 dots above their health bar. This is essentially signifying how many boss health bars this boss has, and given there's 2 separate methods to defeat a boss, be it by opening them up to a lethal attack by draining their posture, or by lowering their health bar to 0 as usual, and both requiring a deathblow attack to knock out a phase, it certainly fits this game's mechanics well. These deathblows can vary whether it means that they'll have different movesets or not for the second or third phase. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It just varies per boss. Despite the system, there are still a handful of bosses that hide at least 1 additional health bar. The first one accessible that will have this, and likely the one of the first bosses you encounter, is Lady Butterfly, who only appears with 1 deathblow marker, but once you blow it, she will reveal you are essentially fighting an illusion. I suspect most people will think something is up with this, because even the mini-bosses up until now all had a second deathblow marker. And this boss had a cutscene and everything, so you can imagine that it is special in some regard. Not to mention you do find snapseeds prior to this that talk about illusions, so that could be a subtle hint as well. Maybe if you could hurt her with a snapseed in phase 1 or something, that'd be another additional good hint, but you're limited on seeds this early in the game, so I'd imagine they want you to waste them either. Genichiro is the next one you're likely to encounter, and a mandatory boss at that. This one might come much more as a surprise, because it has the traditional 2 deathblow markers, and when he busts the second one, he rises again with a near entirely new moveset, and even a new game mechanic that's admittedly a little weird to fully grasp at first, and introducing it during a hidden third phase is a little bit mean in that regard. This is a boss that I very clearly remember being frustrated when I found the hidden phase, because I had been struggling so far to get him down, and I should mention that Sekiro follows the same health template as Dark Souls 3, so pretty much any problem you could point to in Dark Souls 3 would also apply to Sekiro in that regard. Mind you, this game does much more than the rest just demand that you improve at its mechanics, as it's not really an RPG like Dark Souls, so you can't switch builds or what have you. You can only improve your health or damage depending on how many bosses and mini-bosses you encounter, and if I remember correctly, I'd done a good amount of the other main story bosses I could before this, and I still struggled. So, Guardian Imp is the only other one you'll find before the endgame, and this one is particularly devious because it's the first boss, and possibly the only one in the entire series, that gives you the corresponding victory achieved message completely lulling you into a false sense of security that he killed the boss, but then brings him back to life. Even Friede didn't do that, if you recall. Now, I'm sure this is at least in part, probably in major part, to bait players as you'd expect, but it's also in part used to introduce the idea that there's some entities that are immortal if they are infested by the centipedes, even if you may have already been exposed to this in other areas. I know some people really struggle with this boss and had the same experience that I did with Genichiro basically, so you can certainly levy that against it too, especially given the death message, and the fact that his moveset completely changes after this point, although it follows a more traditional parry fight. Personally, I didn't struggle much with the first phase, so it didn't hit badly. I actually quite enjoyed that they went that far to get us, the Madman. A lot of good reaction complaints just came out of it back in the day, but just the same, it is a potential criticism. They kinda get you again with this same boss by having a second boss come out of nowhere in the rematch once you blow away the first marker. Now, I think I have much more of a problem having a dual fight in this game than the hidden health bar, because the mechanics didn't work as well for that kind of encounter. But at the very least, you don't have to kill the second ape to defeat the encounter, and if you choose to, she's super squishy compared to Guardian Ape. So, moving on. The only ones left from here are essentially endgame bosses, and two of the ones we already looked at are optional bosses, so the game doesn't abuse this too much at the very least. If you took the Shura ending route, your last boss will be Emma, who only has one Deathloop marker, so you can fully expect there to be more at this rate. And sure enough, you fight Ishin with his own 2 Deathloop markers. If you go for any other ending, you will encounter Divine Dragon, which if you recall, starts out the fight with these smaller dragons, which is pretty easy, so likewise you probably expect it to be a second phase. And this one being more of a spectacle fight, it's not necessarily the hardest either. And lastly, you got the last fight for the other 3 endings, where you initially rematch Genichiro in his last phase from the last encounter, which you most likely know pretty well by this point, and having many more hours into the game since then, it probably won't be that much of a problem to get through. And you can expect there'll be more just as well. And sure enough, Sword Saint Ishin shows up with 3 additional Deathloop markers, which if you want to be technical, it's the first 4-phase boss fight in the series. Not just by hidden phase, but just phases in general, I'm pretty sure. And Ishin does have different movesets for all of them, so there you go. There's certainly something to be said about having the hidden phases used sparingly, so it can still land with the intended effect, and not be essentially expected every time. And thankfully it'll continue to be used like that going into Elden Ring. So finally looking at the big boy, we're mostly going to be looking at the main bosses. As you know, the boss roster for Elden Ring is humongous, so I don't want to bore you with bosses that, let's be honest, most of us don't care about anyway. Reinala is the first one that has a hidden health bar, and this was likely a lot of people's first Soulsborne game, so it may have been a surprise for more people than before. But given the gimmicky nature of the fight, you can maybe assume that it'll be more, especially when Reinala is one of the main bosses of the game. Next up is Rykard, which might be more effective as a surprise. Despite it also having a gimmick to it, it still very much acts as a normal fight in practice, so it's fully possible it'll get players. Once again, we still have the same Dark Souls 3 healing template, just a reminder. After this, it's not until the very end of the game where we have more, first with the infamous Melania. Due to her difficulty, I'm sure many people actively hoped that she wouldn't have a second phase, but got that slap into reality once she did. I'm conflicted about this one for similar reasons as Ring City and Friede, in that she's obviously intended to be the ultimate challenge of the game, even more so than the final bosses. Certainly by word of mouth a lot of people know that, so a hidden phase probably should be expected, but as it stands now, even her phase 1 being as difficult as it is for first time players with Waterfall and the like, is quite insane. I guess I'm just happy she didn't have a third one, because with that she would be considered horrid by pretty much everyone I think. Not only that, but her second phase also isn't a full HP bar. She starts out with roughly 3/4 full. I guess to actually talk about something different in this Elden Ring segment, let's discuss a preconceived notion that doesn't necessarily have to be the way it is. If you recall a bit of Chaos from Dark Souls 1, I mentioned how I had a 3-stage fight, right? In that one, you had to hit some branches on both sides of the arena in order to open the way to the vulnerable bug, in a similar-ish way to Dragon God. Well, one thing that makes this fight unique, in pretty much the entire series, as this has never been done again to this day, is that this is the only boss where if you were to die or quit out after already having completed a segment of the boss, it will actually stay how it was when you come back. Perhaps it's because they realized how shitty the boss was more than anything, and just wanted to be a little more merciful. But it does show that FromSoft has on occasion made exceptions, and doesn't have to stick to the format for every single boss. Honestly, for some bosses it'd probably just be a quality of life, in the sense that getting through one of the phases can sometimes just be boring. Like think of Nameless King or Sword Saint Ishin, where the first phase isn't even that much of a problem, it just feels like padding to the real boss once you relearn to destroy them. But I'm sure something like that would be appreciated for some bosses like Melania, where both phases are sort of extra, so putting them together is exhausting. The only one after her is Radagon and Elden Beast, who I'm sure we could all see coming for the final boss, just like Soul of Cinder, even if Radagon is difficult in his own right. I mean hell, maybe some people wouldn't even mind having Radagon be skipped to get clean attempts at Elden Beast, especially at launch when Elden Beast was even more annoying, but then again some people prefer fighting Radagon anyway. Lastly, I just want to honorably mention Regal Ancestor Spirit and True Moog, who both have only one health bar, but they do actually heal a portion of their health bar at some point. So in a sense it works somewhat similar to a hidden health bar. To me this doesn't feel as bad for some reason, even though I'm sure seeing the boss heal is a bit demoralizing, so you can certainly poke this idea with holes. I mean that's one of the things that some people don't like about Malenia, that she heals herself when she hits you. But at least that one you can avoid or mitigate by dodging the attacks properly. Meanwhile the other two are somewhat unavoidable, unless you destroy them before they can do it. Also fun fact, Godfrey 1.0 version had his second Luchador phase be a hidden health bar as first, but obviously they changed it once the game released. And lastly for the video, the Scadutree Avatar was the only boss with a truly hidden health bar in the entire Shadows DLC. The rest were in the singular health bar. And even then, this boss fight was still somewhat unique from the rest of the examples, as when you knock this boss down to 0 HP on their current bar, it'll give you a chance to riposte them to have some HP off of the next phase be shaved off ahead of time. Depending on your position when you killed it, you may not have noticed the first time, I definitely didn't, but once you know the second phase is there, you may be more observant the next time around. That's not it however, you can repeat this process one more time for the second third hidden health bar in the series. But not one that feels absolutely demoralizing, because what's more, this boss felt like it had decently scaled health bars. It certainly seemed more squishy than the rest of the bosses in the DLC to this point even, so it's not overtly obsessed with that shock value factor I think. And well, that's all the bosses with a hidden health bar. I hope that's given you something to chew on if you hadn't thought about that deeply yourself, but if you've ever been unmotivated to keep fighting a boss further when you get jump scared by a hidden phase, just know you're not alone, and there could be some legitimate things to pick apart about this whole idea. And I think even FromSoft agrees, given how it approached them after Ashes of Ariandel, and how they always tried to spruce them in here and there instead of every single boss having them, even major ones. But yeah, that's all for the video. If you'd like to see more videos of me breaking down some game mechanics in the Soulsborne games, the Elden Ring, the DLC, or even a small review of the network test for Night Rain, I do have a full playlist with things like that. It also includes that one video where I talk about dual bosses in the entire series. I suspect that would be of interest to you if you made it this far into this video, because I break more the mechanic of having two bosses in one single arena, more than, you know, phases and stuff like that. Next up after this, I do have a little series idea that will be somewhat different from all the content I made so far, even this one or prior to that. But I think if you like this video, you might enjoy aspects of that video too. I don't want to reveal too much, but it's a fun idea, I think. And I hope it turns out well and that people enjoy it. It will be about Elden Ring specifically, and maybe the DLC right after that if it goes well. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, do consider subscribing. As I jokingly said earlier, you can also become a member and join these fella right here if you would like to support my channel. Again, it's like 99 cents base, so taxes and stuff like that. Your name will obviously be there, and you can also get early access to videos. Like this one was probably gonna be done like a week early because I have plans when it's actually released, but I wanted to have it done early. And then I might even have the other one ready not too long after as well. So if you want early access to videos, that can be anywhere from a day or two to weeks ahead of time, depending on how much ahead I am. But yeah, however you decide to continue browsing my channel, I appreciate it. And I hope to see you again, everybody. So have a good one. Bye-bye.